Every engineer in Japan looked at the same numbers and saw a wall. Jiro Horikoshi looked at them and saw a door. But the door had a price, and the price was human. 1,937. The Imperial Navy needed a fighter that could outfly everything in the American arsenal. One problem: the engine. 1,000 horsepower, 200 less than its American rival. Not enough power to carry speed, range, agility, firepower, and armor together. Something had to go. Horikoshi made the coldest calculation of the Pacific War. He kept the speed, kept the range, kept the maneuverability, and crossed out the line that said pilot protection. For 18 months, it worked perfectly. No Allied fighter could touch the A6M Zero. Then an American lieutenant with a box of kitchen matches figured out the flaw Horikoshi had built into every airframe, and the masterpiece began to kill its own pilots. To understand how Jiro Horikoshi arrived at that calculation, you have to understand where he came from, and more importantly, what he had already proven before the Imperial Navy asked him to do the impossible. Horikoshi was born on June 22, 1903, in the small town of Fujioka, in Gunma Prefecture, north of Tokyo. A quiet place. Rice paddies, silk farms, mountain air. Nothing about it suggested aviation. But Horikoshi was drawn to flight, the way certain minds are drawn to problems that don't yet have solutions. He enrolled in the Department of Aeronautical Engineering at the University of Tokyo. He graduated in 1927 at the top of his class, and he walked straight into Mitsubishi. At 24 years old, Jiro Horikoshi entered one of the largest industrial corporations in Japan and began designing machines built to kill. Not because he wanted war, but because the only employer hiring aeronautical engineers. In 927, Japan was a military-industrial complex. There was no civilian aviation industry worth the name. If you wanted to build airplanes, you built them for the Navy or the Army. There was no third option. For the next decade, Horikoshi climbed through Mitsubishi's engineering ranks. He studied foreign designs. He absorbed the principles of European and American aerodynamics. And he noticed something that would define higher, and Japanese engines were weaker than Western engines. Not slightly weaker, fundamentally weaker. The gap was not closing. If anything, it was widening. Every design choice Horikoshi would ever make was shaped by this single constraint. When your engine gives you less, everything else must give you more, or you find something to take away. His first major solo design was the A5M, designated Type 96 by the Navy. It was a compact, lightweight, open-cockpit monoplane fighter built to operate from aircraft carriers. When it entered service in 1937 and flew combat missions over China, it became one of the first monoplane carrier-based fighters in the world to prove itself in actual combat. The biplane era was ending, and Horikoshi was among the engineers who buried it. The A5M was fast for its time. It was agile. Pilots loved it. But Horikoshi already knew it was not enough. The Navy wanted more range, more speed, more firepower, and the engines were still weak. Then, in 1937, the Navy issued the specification that would make Horikoshi famous and curse everything he touched. The document was called the 12-sheets specification. In plain terms, it was a wish list, but it read more like a fantasy. The Imperial Navy wanted a single carrier-based fighter capable of exceeding 500 kilometers per hour in level flight. It had to climb to 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. It needed a combat range exceeding 2 hours at normal power, and with a drop tank 6 to 8 hours. It had to be more maneuverable than the A5M it was replacing. It had to carry two 20mm cannons in addition to machine guns, and it had to take off and land on the pitching deck of an aircraft carrier, with an engine producing roughly 1,000 horsepower. For context, The American Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp produced 1,200 horsepower. The British Rolls-Royce Merlin, which would power the Spitfire, was already being developed toward 1,400. Horikoshi had 1,200 horsepower less than his American rival, and the Navy wanted him to build something better than anything America or Britain had. The engineering team at Nakajima, Japan's other major aircraft manufacturer, looked at the 12 numbers. They ran the calculations. They submitted an initial design, then withdrew from the competition. Their conclusion was blunt. The specification could not be met with existing power plant technology. The physics did not permit it. Horikoshi looked at the same numbers. He ran the same calculations, and he reached a different conclusion, not because the physics were different for him, but because he was willing to sacrifice a variable that Nakajima would not touch. The fundamental equation of fighter aircraft design is simple in principle and merciless in practice. Performance equals power divided by weight. With power fixed at 1,000 horsepower, the only way to increase performance was to decrease weight. Every kilogram removed from the airframe bought another kilometer of range, another fraction of climb rate, another degree of turn performance. Horikoshi understood this with the precision of a mathematician and the instinct of an artist. He began cutting. First, the obvious weight. Simplified structures, thinner skin panels, fewer fasteners. He adopted extra super duralumin, a Japanese aluminum alloy, lighter than standard aircraft-grade aluminum, but more vulnerable to corrosion and more prone to fire damage. He engineered the wing spars to carry exactly the load they needed, and not 1 gram more. He designed the fuselage cross-section to minimize drag, while maintaining just enough structural integrity for carrier operations. Then he cut the things that were not supposed to be cut. No pilot armor, no armor plate behind the seat, no armor glass in the windscreen. Nothing between the pilot's body and incoming fire except a thin sheet of duralumin. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A bullet puncturing the fuel tank would not trigger a chemical reaction to seal the hole. It would create a fuel leak, and fuel leaks, in combat, meant fire. Horikoshi understood the physics of this decision with perfect clarity. Without armor and self-sealing tanks, the airplane would weigh approximately 1,680 kilograms empty. That was roughly 900 pounds lighter than an equivalent American design would be. 900 pounds bought him everything the Navy asked for: speed, range, climb, maneuverability. All of it paid for by removing the things that kept a pilot alive found their way inside the cockpit. In his post-war writings, Horikoshi addressed this trade-off directly. With the available engine power, he explained, there was no solution that included both superior performance and pilot protection. The Navy's specification demanded performance. Horikoshi delivered performance. The cost was implicit in the mathematics. He did not hide it, but he also did not have the authority, or perhaps the standing, to tell the Imperial Navy that their specification was asking him to design a machine optimized for a short war, and that if the war was not short, the pilots inside his machine would pay for it. The first prototype, designated A6M flew on April 1st, 1939, powered by a Mitsubishi A6M 13 engine, producing 780 horsepower. Performance was promising, but fell short of the 12 targets. The engine was simply too weak. Horikoshi pushed for a switch to the Nakajima Sake 12, a 14-cylinder radial producing close to 1,000 horsepower. The Navy agreed. The redesigned aircraft, now designated A6M2, flew for the first time in late December 1939. The results exceeded every parameter in the specification. Top speed was approximately 330 miles per hour with boost. Saburo Sakai one of Japan's most experienced combat pilots, would later record 345 miles per hour in his memoir. Though this figure likely represented optimal conditions, operational range reached 1,160 miles on internal fuel alone. With a centerline 330-liter drop tank, maximum range stretched beyond 1,900 miles. No single-engine carrier fighter in the world came close. The service ceiling touched 37,000 feet, and the maneuverability was extraordinary. The airplane responded to the pilot's hands with a precision that test pilots described as almost telepathic. Armed with two Type 97 machine guns of 7.7mm caliber, 680 rounds per gun, synchronized with the propeller and mounted above the engine, and two Type 99 120mm cannons in the wings, holding 60 rounds each. The Zero carried a mixed armament broadly comparable to the German Bf 109. The 20mm cannons gave it a punch that few Allied fighters of the era could match, though the low 60-round drum capacity meant the cannons ran dry quickly in sustained combat. Jiro Horikoshi had done it. He had solved the impossible specification, and now the Navy wanted proof. It came on September 13th, 1940, over the wartime capital of Chongqing, China. 13 A6M Zeros escorted a formation of Japanese bombers into hostile airspace. Roughly 27 to 34 Chinese fighters rose to intercept. They were Polikarpov I-15 biplanes and 16 monoplanes, both of Soviet manufacture, flown by pilots with real combat experience against Japanese aircraft over the previous 3 years. The engagement lasted minutes. Every Chinese fighter was either shot down or destroyed. The Zeros sustained no losses, no damage. The combat reports reaching Horikoshi in Nagoya confirmed everything his slide rule had predicted. The A6M was not merely competitive, it was dominant. Nothing in the sky over China could touch it. Intelligence reports about the engagement filtered westward. Allied military attaches in China forwarded descriptions of a new Japanese fighter of exceptional performance, faster than expected, more maneuverable than anything known, capable of ranges that seemed implausible for a single-engine aircraft. London and Washington received the reports and did nothing. The reasons were multiple, and none of them were rational. Institutional arrogance played a role. So did racial prejudice. The prevailing assumption among Western military planners was that Japan could not produce a world-class fighter aircraft. Japanese industry was considered derivative, capable of copying Western designs, but not surpassing them. The idea that a Japanese engineer had built a fighter superior to anything in the American or British inventory was, to the men reading those intelligence cables, simply not credible. So the cables were filed, the reports were archived, and 15 months later, on December 7th, 1941, the A6M Zero appeared over Pearl Harbor, and over the Philippines, and over Malaya, and over the Dutch East Indies, and nothing the Allies put in the sky could stop it. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Horikoshi's creation carved through every fighter the Allies could field. Brewster Buffaloes over Malaya fell apart against Zeros flown by experienced carrier pilots. Curtiss P-40s and P-36s over the Philippines fought bravely, but were outclassed in the close-turning combat their pilots had been trained to seek. Hawker Hurricanes in the Dutch East Indies, veterans of the Battle of Britain, discovered that tactics designed against the Luftwaffe were suicidal against an opponent this agile. In theater after theater, the pattern repeated. Allied pilots, trained in the doctrine of dogfighting, met an aircraft purpose-built to win every dogfight, and they died. The dominance was so complete, so total, that it concealed the one truth that mattered most. Because no Allied pilot was landing enough rounds, zero, to discover what happened when those rounds connected. In those first 6 months, the Zero's fatal flaw was invisible, not because it did not exist, but because winning too thoroughly hid the evidence. When no one shoots back effectively, you never learn that your aircraft cannot survive being shot. When every opponent falls before landing a meaningful burst, you never discover that a single .50 caliber round through the fuel tank will turn your cockpit into an inferno. When combat ends in seconds, the absence of armor is an abstraction, not a death sentence. Horikoshi's genius was validated in every engagement report. Speed, range, maneuverability, firepower. The 12-she specification had been met and exceeded. The Zero was, by every measurable standard, the finest carrier-based fighter aircraft in the world. But measurable standards do not measure what happens when the war does not end on schedule. And across the Pacific, inside the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, on Long Island, New York, a very different philosophy of fighter design was about to collide with everything Horikoshi had built. Grumman was known in the American Navy by a single nickname, the Iron Works, not because their aircraft were elegant, not because they were fast, because they were built to bring pilots home. The F-4 Wildcat was the physical opposite of the Zero in almost every respect. Where Horikoshi shaved weight, Grumman added it. Where Horikoshi sacrificed armor, Grumman bolted it on. Pilot armor behind the seat, armor glass in the windscreen, self-sealing fuel tanks that chemically reacted to seal bullet punctures before fuel could leak and ignite. Those protective features alone added roughly 900 pounds to the airframe. 900 pounds that Horikoshi had removed from his design to buy performance. The F-4 Wildcat weighed 5,700 pounds empty. Loaded for combat, it approached 8,000 pounds, nearly double the Zero in empty weight. Its Pratt & Whitney R1000, 830, Twin Wasp produced 1,200 horsepower, 200 more than Horikoshi's Sakai 12, but that extra power was swallowed whole by the extra weight. Maximum speed reached only 318 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, slower than the Zero. Combat range was 770 miles, nearly 400 miles less than the Zero. Service ceiling was 34,000 feet, 3,000 feet below the Zero. In a turning fight, the comparison was not even close. The Zero could fly circles around the Wildcat, and the Wildcat's pilot knew it. On paper, the Wildcat lost to the Zero in almost every category that fighter pilots cared about: speed, range, climb rate, turn radius, ceiling, acceleration. By the metrics that defined fighter superiority in 1941, the F-4F was the inferior aircraft. It won in exactly two areas: dive speed, because its heavier airframe accelerated faster in a steep descent, and survivability, because 900 pounds of armor and self-sealing tanks meant that when bullets hit a Wildcat, the pilot had a chance to fly home, land, debrief, learn from his mistakes, and fight again tomorrow. Those two advantages did not look like much. On a specification sheet, they looked like consolation prizes for an airplane that could not compete. But the specification sheet measured the wrong things. Because the specification sheet measured performance in a single engagement, and wars are not single engagements. Wars are thousands of engagements, fought over months and years by pilots who either survive to improve or die before they learn. Horikoshi designed a masterpiece for the first engagement. Grumman designed as a survivor for the long war. In December 1941, no one yet knew which philosophy would win, but the answer was already written into the physics of both airframes, waiting for enough to commemorate it. And that combat was coming. Not in the skies over China, where the Zero had no equal, but over the Coral Sea, where a lieutenant commander named James Flatley would be the first American officer to look at Horikoshi's creation, understand exactly what it was, and write down the instructions for how to fight it without dying. The Coral Sea, May 7th, 1942, 5 months after Pearl Harbor. 5 months of unbroken Japanese aerial dominance across the Pacific. And aboard the carrier USS Yorktown, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley was about to become the first American officer to truly understand what Jiro Horikoshi had built. Task Force 17 launched its strike against the Japanese light carrier Shoho that morning. 8 F-4 F-3 Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 42, VF-42, flew escort for the incoming torpedo bombers. It was among the first large-scale encounters between Wildcats and Zeros over open ocean, and it unfolded according to a pattern that Horikoshi's design made almost inevitable. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol concentrated its attacks on the torpedo bombers. The slow, vulnerable aircraft dropping down to wave height demanded immediate attention. This left the 8 Wildcats relatively unmolested. Of the 3 Zeros airborne over Shoho, 1 was shot down, a modest result, but a result nonetheless. The Wildcats had engaged, survived, and scored. The next day was different. The next day was education through blood. On May 8th, a division from VF-42, likely 6 aircraft, escorted torpedo bombers again, this time supported by 9 additional Wildcats from VF-2. They flew into a sky that Horikoshi's creation owned. 3 Wildcats were shot down. The American pilots claimed 3 Zeros in return, but the Japanese pilots filed claims for 18 Wildcats destroyed. 18, more than the total number of American fighters, probably in the air that day. Overclaiming was a disease that infected both sides of every air war, born not from dishonesty, but from the chaos of combat at 300 miles per hour, where a smoking airplane seen from a quarter-mile away could be a kill or could be a plane flying home with a damaged engine. The fog of air combat was as thick as any fog on any battlefield, and the numbers it produced were fantasies dressed in official ink. Later that afternoon, the real test came. 20 Wildcats scrambled to intercept a Japanese strike package escorted by 18 Zeros. The Wildcats had to split their attention between the Zeros and the incoming attack aircraft. 3 F-4Fs went down. In return, it appears that only 1 Zero was actually destroyed. In pure numbers, Coral Sea was not a disaster for the Wildcat, but James Flatley, 36 years old, a career Navy pilot who had spent his adult life in cockpits, did something after the battle that almost no one else in his position was willing to do. He told the truth. Flatley's after-action report did not dress the results in comfortable language. He did not blame pilot error or bad luck or insufficient numbers. He looked at what had happened over the Coral Sea and wrote down in plain official prose what Horikoshi's design could do and what his own aircraft could not. The Zero was more maneuverable. The Zero was faster in a climb. The Zero could follow a Wildcat in the initial phase of a dive. In a traditional dogfight, the turning, twisting, throttle jockeying combat that every Navy pilot had been trained to seek, the Zero held every advantage. Then Flatley did something more important than admitting the problem. He wrote the solution, his document, distributed among Navy fighter pilots under the heading of Tactical Hints, laid out a set of rules that contradicted virtually everything American pilots had been taught about aerial combat. Never engage a Zero in a dogfight. Never attempt to follow a Zero in a climb at low speed. Maintain high speed at all times. Attack from above using the dive, fire, and extend away before the Zero can bring its superior maneuverability to bear. And one detail that was saving Japanese lives because American pilots did not understand it. When the Zero activated its engine boost, a visible flame and thick black smoke trailed from the exhaust. Allied pilots, seeing smoke and fire, repeatedly assumed they had scored a fatal hit and broke off their attack. In reality, the Zero was accelerating. It was not dying, it was running, and the American who stopped shooting was letting it escape. Each of Flatley's tactical hints was, without him knowing it, a precise identification of the specific engineering trade-offs that Jiro Horikoshi had made 5 years earlier in Nagoya. When Flatley wrote that the Zero dominated in low-speed turning combat, he was describing the consequences of Horikoshi's lightweight airframe, the 3,700-pound empty weight that allowed the Zero to sustain tight turns without bleeding energy. When Flatley wrote that the Wildcat could escape in a dive, he was describing the consequence of Grumman's heavier construction, the 5,700 pounds of armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural reinforcement that made the F-4F accelerate faster in a steep descent. When Flatley wrote that the Zero became sluggish at high speeds, he was identifying the aerodynamic penalty of Horikoshi's thin, lightly loaded wing, designed to maximize performance at low and medium speeds, but increasingly stiff and unresponsive as airflow approached the structural limits of its lightweight construction. Flatley had never heard the name Jiro Horikoshi. He had never seen a blueprint of the A6M2. He had never read the 12-she specification. But in the space of a single after-action report, he had reverse-engineered the design philosophy of a man on the other side of the Pacific and identified every seam, every joint, every deliberate weakness in the architecture of Genius. The hints were distributed. Pilots read them. Some believed them, some did not. But the conversation had changed. Before Flatley, the official position was that American tactics were sound and American aircraft were adequate. After Flatley, the official position was no longer tenable. The Zero was better in a dogfight, and dogfighting against it was suicide. The old way of flying had to die so that pilots could live. 27 days after the Coral Sea, on June 4th, 1942, the proof arrived over Midway. Lieutenant John Thack, 37 years old, commanding VF-3, was leading 6 F-4 F-3 Wildcats as escort for Torpedo Squadron 6. Their mission was to protect the torpedo bombers as they made their attack runs against the Japanese carrier fleet. It was, by any honest assessment, a mission with a low probability of survival. The torpedo bombers were slow, unarmored, and required long, straight approach runs at wave-top altitude. They were targets, and the Zeros knew it. What happened next was among the most consequential tactical experiments in the history of aerial warfare. Before the war, before Pearl Harbor, before Coral Sea, Thack had received a fragmentary intelligence report describing a new Japanese fighter of exceptional maneuverability. Most officers who received the same report dismissed it or ignored it. Thack did not. He sat at his kitchen table with a box of matchsticks, arranged them in pairs, and began working out the geometry of a problem that no amount of engine power or pilot skill could solve through conventional means. How do you fight an airplane that can outturn you, outclimb you, and stay with you in almost every regime of flight? His answer was not aeronautical, it was mathematical. 2 aircraft flying in a loose pair, roughly a beam of each other, with enough separation to allow crossing maneuvers. When an enemy fighter committed to an attack on one Wildcat, that aircraft would turn toward its partner. The partner would simultaneously turn toward the threatened aircraft. The result was a scissoring motion that forced the attacking Zero into a head-on pass against the crossing Wildcat, a situation where the Zero's maneuverability advantage and the Wildcat's 6 heavy machine guns pointed directly at the incoming enemy. If the Zero broke off the attack, the weave reset. If the Zero pressed the attack, it flew into a convergence of 50 caliber fire. If it tried to follow the turning wildcat through the weave, it exposed its belly and its tail to the crossing partner. The geometry was simple. The execution, at 400 miles per hour, with tracers cutting the air around you, was anything but. Over midway, Thash called for the weave for the first time in actual combat. At least 20 Zeros dove on his small formation. The torpedo bombers below were being slaughtered. Thak could not save them. He could barely save himself, but the weave worked. The two wildcats scissored back and forth, forcing zero after zero into head-on passes or into the gun sights of the crossing partner. Thak and his wingman shot down at least 4 Zeros. His division claimed 2 more. 1 wildcat was lost. Every surviving aircraft came back with bullet holes in the fuselage, the wings, the engine cowling. Later that afternoon, Navy pilots claimed another 5 Zeros for the loss of 4 wildcats. Thak survived midway. He filed his after-action report and, like Flatley before him, he refused to paint the picture in colors it did not deserve. The weave had worked, he acknowledged. Gunnery training was paying off. His specific tactical preparation had achieved the desired effect, but Thak was unflinching in his broader assessment. The F-4F was still the inferior airplane. The weave did not change that. It did not make the Wildcat equal to the Zero. What it did was transform a slaughter into an exchange rate that the United States could sustain and Japan could not. Thak also noted something else, something that had nothing to do with airplanes and everything to do with the men flying them. Some of the Japanese pilots he encountered over Midway seemed overconfident, others seemed overconfident, others seemed less experienced than what he would have expected from the carrier elite that had swept the Pacific for 6 months. It was a small observation buried in a larger report, but it pointed toward a truth that would take another year to become fully visible. And on the same day that Thak was fighting for his life, over Midway, 600 miles to the north, the answer to Horikoshi's genius was falling out of the sky over a marshy island in the Aleutians. The Japanese had launched a diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor, Alaska, as part of the broader Midway operation. Among the attacking aircraft was an A6M Zero flown by Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga. He was 19 years old. Anti-aircraft fire struck his plane, severing an oil return line. Koga attempted an emergency landing on Akutan Island, a small uninhabited patch of tundra and bog in the eastern Aleutians. His wheels touched down on what looked like solid ground. It was not. The marshy surface grabbed the landing gear and flipped the Zero onto its back. Koga's neck broke on impact. He died instantly, alone, in a wrecked aircraft on an island that most Americans could not find on a map. His airplane survived almost intact. On July 10, 1942, a Navy PBY patrol aircraft spotted the wreckage. A recovery team extracted the Zero, crated it, and shipped it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. Engineers and mechanics spent weeks repairing it. By September, the Akutan Zero was airborne again, painted in American markings, flown by American test pilots, who for the first time could measure exactly what Horikoshi had created. The test results became Intelligence Information Summary number 85, and it was one of the most important technical documents of the Pacific War. IIS No. 85 confirmed, in precise numbers, everything that Flatley had observed at Coral Sea and Thak had exploited at Midway. Below 300 miles per hour, the Mepinubed the F-4F in every category. The turning comparison was not even a contest. Any speed where a traditional dogfight would occur, the Zero was dominant. But above 300 miles per hour, approaching its maximum speed in level flight, the Zero became, in the document's own phrasing, increasingly sluggish and unresponsive. The lightweight controls that gave the airplane its extraordinary agility at moderate speeds became stiff and difficult to move at high speeds. a direct consequence of the aerodynamic forces acting on Horikoshi's thin, lightly constructed control surfaces. The document also noted that the Zero had significant difficulty with negative G maneuvers, a result of its float-type carburetor and lightweight airframe design. The recommendations were straightforward. Never follow a Zero into a climb at low speed. Maintain high velocity. Attack from altitude. Use the dive. Avoid prolonged turning engagements below 300 miles per hour. But the test results also contained contradictions that revealed the limits of testing a repaired aircraft under safe laboratory conditions. The maximum speeds recorded during testing fell as low as 280 miles per hour, a figure so far below operational reality that it was essentially meaningless. The repaired airframe had altered aerodynamics. The test pilots used conservative engine settings to avoid destroying an irreplaceable intelligence asset. Different test runs on the same airplane produced different speed figures, even when the conditions appeared identical. Each American document evaluating the Akutan Zero quoted a different number. The captured airplane was a window into Horikoshi's design, but the glass was warped. The comparison flights with American aircraft told the real story. Against the F-4F, the document stated that the Zero was superior in speed, climb, and maneuverability at low to moderate velocities. It noted that the two aircraft were comparable in a dive, a finding that seemed to contradict Flatley's earlier assessment that the Wildcat was clearly superior in diving. The discrepancy likely reflected the difference between the initial phase of a dive, where the lighter Zero could briefly keep pace, and a sustained dive, where the heavier Wildcat pulled away. IIS number 85 was measuring the first few seconds. Flatley was measuring the full escape. The document confirmed that, in a turning fight, there was no comparison. The Zero simply did it better, and it was not even close. And here was the deepest irony of IIS No. 85. By the time it was completed and distributed, the pilots at the front lines already knew every word in it. They had learned it not from captured airplanes and test flights, but burning oil and dead wingmen. Flatley's hints had been circulating for months. Thak's weave had been proven at Midway. The frontline pilots had written their own version of IIS number 85 in blood, and the men behind desks were only now catching up. But IIS number 85 served a different purpose. It was not written for the pilots who were fighting Zeros. It was written for the engineers, the procurement officers, the training commanders, and the institutional bureaucracy that had spent months dismissing frontline reports as exaggeration or excuse-making. The document gave them black and white data they could not argue with. The Zero was better in a dogfight. The F-4F could not beat it using conventional methods. These were not the opinions of frightened pilots under stress. These were measurements taken in controlled conditions on American soil. And in one final twist of timing, by the date IIS number 85 was formally released, Japan had already begun replacing the A6M2 with the newer A6M3. Intelligence, as always, was chasing the war rather than leading it. While Thak fought over Midway and Koga's Zero sat in the Aleutian mud waiting to be found, the air war was about to enter its most brutal phase. And it would happen over a jungle airstrip on an island that most Americans had never heard of. Guadalcanal. Henderson Field was a strip of packed coral and dirt carved out of the jungle on the northern coast of Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands. It was named after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. From August through November of 1942, it became the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific, and the place where Horikoshi's masterpiece collided with the reality of sustained attrition warfare. Among the first fighter units to operate from Henderson Field was VMF 223, commanded by Major John Lucian Smith. 29 years old, from Lexington, Oklahoma. Smith was a Marine pilot to his core, aggressive, direct, and constitutionally incapable of sugarcoating anything. His squadron flew F-4F Wildcats out of a field that was shelled by Japanese warships at night, bombed by Japanese aircraft during the day, and turned into a swamp by tropical rain in between. Maintenance was conducted with whatever tools and parts were available. Pilots flew exhausted, slept in foxholes, and took off knowing that the field they left might be under naval bombardment by the time they returned. The air battles over Guadalcanal were daily, relentless, and characterized by a phenomenon that corrupted the data on both sides so thoroughly that the true shape of the fighting remained obscured for decades. Overclaiming. On August 24, 1942, VMF 223 intercepted a formation of Japanese attack aircraft and their Zero escorts. American pilots reported destroying 11 bombers and 5 Zeros. The actual Japanese losses, verified through post-war records, were 3 bombers and 1 Zero, a ratio of roughly 3-to-1 between claimed and actual kills. On the same day, Japanese pilots claimed 15 Wildcats destroyed. Actual American losses were 3 F-4Fs. The Japanese overclaiming ratio was 5-to-1. 2 days later, VMF 223 claimed another 8 bombers and 5 Zeros. 3 A6M2s were actually lost. On August 30th, 14 Zero kills were claimed by American pilots. Post-war Japanese records show 9 were actually destroyed. Even at the most accurate end of the scale, the overclaiming ratio held at roughly 1.5-to-1. At the worst, it approached 5-to-1. This was not dishonesty. This was the nature of aerial combat. A pilot fires a burst at an enemy aircraft at convergent speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. He sees smoke, or a piece breaking free, or a sudden roll. He is immediately engaged by another enemy aircraft and loses sight of his target. Did it crash? Did it recover? Was the smoke from a fatal hit, or from an engine at full boost? In the chaos of a multi-aircraft engagement, accurate kill confirmation was almost impossible. Both sides inflated their numbers because both sides were reporting what they believed they saw, filtered through adrenaline, speed, terror, different, and the desperate human need to believe that the killing meant something. But the overclaiming masked a reality that Horikoshi's design was making more visible with every passing week. The Americans were losing aircraft, but the pilots were surviving. The F-4F's armor plate, its self-sealing fuel tanks, its rugged Grumman construction absorbed hits that would have been fatal in a Zero and turned them into damaged airplanes that limped home to Henderson Field. Pilots landed with holes in their wings, oil streaming from punctured lines, instruments shot away. They climbed out, were debriefed, were assigned a new or repaired aircraft, and flew again the next day. Each engagement that did not kill them made them better. Each landing they survived added to their understanding of the Zero, its tendencies, its patterns, the specific angles and speeds at which it was vulnerable. The Japanese were also losing aircraft, but their pilots were dying. Horikoshi's decision to remove armor and self-sealing tanks meant that damage that an F-4F absorbed and survived was damage that killed a Zero pilot. A 50 caliber, armor-piercing, incendiary round that struck a Wildcat's self-sealing fuel tank would be chemically sealed before the fuel could ignite. The same round striking a Zero's unprotected fuel tank would rupture it, spill aviation gasoline into the fuselage, and create conditions for a fire that no pilot could survive. A burst that hit a Wildcat's armored seatback would be stopped before reaching the pilot's spine. The same burst hitting a Zero would pass through the thin duralumin skin and into the pilot's body without meaningful resistance. The mathematics were simple and merciless. Each American pilot who survived a damaged landing became a veteran, Each Japanese pilot who did not survive was replaced, eventually, by a pilot with fewer flight hours, less training, and none of the hard-won combat instincts that kept veterans alive. Major Smith knew this, not from statistics or intelligence summaries, but from watching the sky over Henderson Field day after day. When he was told that American flight testing had concluded the F-4 was approximately equal to the Zero in speed, his response was instant and undiplomatic. The report, Smith said, was flat wrong. The Zero was faster, period. The men in the testing facilities, flying captured aircraft under controlled conditions with conservative engine settings, were measuring something that did not exist in the skies over Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Leroy Simpler, commanding VF-5, agreed. He had led his own squadron against Zeros in the same skies and reached the same conclusion. The test data did not match the combat reality. The Zero was faster than the Wildcat in level flight, and any pilot who flew against one knew it. The disconnect between frontline experience and rear echelon analysis was not merely academic. It was dangerous. Pilots who trusted the testing data and assumed speed parity would make tactical decisions based on a false premise, and those decisions could be fatal. But Smith, Simpler, and every other frontline commander also understood something that the raw performance numbers did not capture. The Wildcat was holding its own, not because it was a better airplane. It was not. But because the combination of proper tactics, good gunnery, disciplined flying, and an airframe that could absorb punishment was producing exchange rates that the United States could sustain and Japan could not. Until a better airplane arrived, this was enough. It had to be. And then, on August 7th, the same day that the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the most vivid proof of Horikoshi's fatal tradeoff fell from the sky over the island. Saburo Sakai was 25 years old. He was, by any reasonable measure, among the finest fighter pilots Japan had produced. 64 confirmed aerial victories. He had fought over China, over the Philippines, over the Dutch East Indies. His reflexes, his eyesight, his understanding of aerial geometry were products of a training pipeline so demanding that most candidates washed out before they ever touched a cockpit. The Japanese naval aviation training system consumed 2 to 3 years per pilot, producing aviators of extraordinary skill at a rate that was wholly incompatible with the demands of a global war. The system was designed to produce samurai of the sky. It was not designed to produce replacements. Sakai's skill was exceptional, but his aircraft was still a Zero, and on that day, over Guadalcanal, Horikoshi's design could not protect him from what happened next. Sakai spotted a group of aircraft that he identified as F-4F Wildcats. He maneuvered into attack position, closed the distance, and committed to his firing pass. They were not Wildcats. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and unlike the single-seat Wildcat, the Dauntless carried a rear-seat gunner with a pair of .30 caliber machine guns pointed directly at any fighter approaching from behind. The gunner opened fires, struck Sakai in the head. The right side of his skull was hit. He lost vision in his right eye immediately. The left side of his body went partially paralyzed. Blood filled his remaining eye. At combat speed, over enemy-held territory, Saburo Sakai was effectively blind, half paralyzed, and alone. What happened next was a testament to the skill that the Japanese training system had built into him over years of relentless preparation. Sakai flew for 4 hours and 47 minutes, nearly 5 hours, much of it in a state between consciousness and blackout, navigating by the sun when he could see it, by dead reckoning when he could not. He landed at Rabaul using one eye, fighting the controls with one functional arm, putting the Zero down on the runway, through what can only be described as sheer, desperate mastery of his aircraft. He survived. The airplane was full of holes, And here was the truth that Sakai's survival illuminated more clearly than any intelligence document or after-action report. Sakai lived because he was Saburo Sakai, because his thousands of hours of training gave him the ability to fly a damaged airplane half-blind for 5 hours. But Horikoshi's design had done nothing to save him. There was no armor plate behind his head to stop the round that took his eye. There was no armored glass to deflect the fragments that partially paralyzed him. The Zero was a perfect offensive weapon that offered its pilot nothing when the offense failed. Sakai's skill compensated for what Horikoshi's design lacked, but skill like Sakai's took years to build, and most Japanese pilots did not have it. If Sakai had been flying a Wildcat, the 900 pounds of armor that Horikoshi had chosen to eliminate might have stopped the round before it reached his skull. The self-sealing fuel tanks might have prevented the fuel leak that could have killed him on the flight home. The armored seatback that Grumman engineers insisted on and that Horikoshi could not afford in weight budget might have been the difference between a wounded pilot and a dead one. Every pound that the Wildcat carried and the Zero did not was a pound designed to keep exactly this from happening. But Sakai was the exception. He was the ace who proved the rule, because the young pilots who were beginning to replace the casualties at Rabaul and Truk and the forward base across the Pacific did not have Sakai's hours. They did not have his sight. They did not have his instinctive understanding of the aircraft's limits. They had been pushed through an accelerated training pipeline that Japan had been forced to adopt as losses mounted. A pipeline that produced pilots with a fraction of the flight hours that Sakai's generation had accumulated, and they were being put into zeros. Horikoshi's masterpiece was designed for experts. The lightweight controls, the extraordinary responsiveness, the razor-thin margin between performance and structural failure, all of it assumed a pilot with the hands, the judgment, and the experience to exploit it. In the hands of a Sakai, the Zero was transcendent. In the hands of a pilot with 200 hours of flight time and no combat experience, it was an aircraft that demanded perfection and punished every mistake with fire. The Americans, meanwhile, were cycling their surviving pilots through a system that extracted knowledge and distributed it to every new aviator entering the war. A Wildcat pilot who survived 3 months over Guadalcanal was rotated home, assigned to a training unit, and spent the next year teaching the next generation of fighter pilots everything he had learned about fighting Zeros. His hard-won understanding of Horikoshi's design, its strengths, its weaknesses, the specific speeds and altitudes, where it could be engaged and where it could not, was transferred systematically from veteran to student, to frontline, to veteran to student again. The knowledge compounded. Japan did not have this system. The culture of the Imperial Navy did not rotate aces home to train replacements. The best pilots stayed at the front until they were killed or too badly wounded to continue. Their knowledge died with them. Each ace lost was a library burned. And the replacements who arrived to take their places carried none of that institutional memory. In Nagoya, Horikoshi was aware of the mounting losses. He understood, with the cold precision that defined his engineering, that the A6M2's lack of protection was becoming a strategic liability. But he could not change the fundamental equation. The A6M3, already entering service, carried an improved engine, the Nakajima Sakai 21, producing roughly 1,130 horsepower, more power, but not enough more to add meaningful armor without destroying the performance characteristics that defined the Zero. Adding pilot armor, self-sealing tanks, and structural reinforcement to the existing airframe would increase weight by nearly 1,000 pounds. And reduce performance to the point where the airplane was no longer the airplane the Navy depended on. Horikoshi was trapped inside his own equation. The genius solution of 1,000 937. The radical weight reduction that made the impossible possible had become a cage. The same mathematics that gave the Zero its dominance now prevented Horikoshi from fixing the flaw that was killing his pilots. He could not add protection without removing performance. He could not remove performance without negating the purpose of the aircraft. The 12-she specification, answered so brilliantly 6 years earlier, had become a prison sentence for every pilot who climbed into a cockpit with no armor behind his back and no self-sealing tank beneath his seat. And across the Pacific, the Americans were not standing still. The Wildcat was holding the line, but it was holding a line that both sides knew was temporary. In factories on Long Island and in Connecticut, a new generation of American fighters was taking shape. Aircraft designed not to compensate for weakness, but to dominate from strength. Aircraft with engines of 2,000 horsepower and more, capable of carrying speed, firepower, armor, and maneuverability simultaneously. The luxury that Horikoshi never had, the overwhelming engine power that would have allowed him to build both performance and protection into the same airframe, was about to arrive in the hands of his enemies. The masterpiece was running out of sky. By early 1943, the lessons written in fuel smoke and blood over the Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal had been distilled into doctrine. Not theory, not suggestions, doctrine. The Americans had watched Horikoshi's creation long enough to map its every strength, and in that map, they found the narrow corridors where it could be killed. The tactical manual that emerged from those months of attrition read like an inversion of everything fighter pilots had been taught since the First World War. Altitude was the first commandment. No section of Wildcats was to engage a zero formation without at least 2,000 feet of height advantage. Altitude was energy, and energy was the only currency that bought survival against an airplane that could outturn you at any speed below 300 miles per hour. The second commandment was concentration. Both aircraft in a two-plane section fired at a target, not two targets, one, every round converging on one airframe, because a Zero that absorbed enough 50 caliber hits to compromise its unprotected fuel system or its unarmored pilot did not limp home. It burned. The third commandment was the rhythm of attack. Dive, fire, dive again. Never linger in the Zero's envelope. Never allow the engagement to slow below the speed, where the Wildcat's weight advantage in a dive became the Zero's maneuverability advantage in a turn. The fourth commandment was the hardest to obey. If a Zero climbed to pursue, do not follow. Switch targets. Take the next Zero in the formation. Let the climbing Zero waste its energy chasing altitude while you maintained yours. The tactical illustration was precise. A section of 2 Wildcats against a shotai of 3 Zeros. The section holds altitude, identifies the highest Zero in the formation, the tail-end aircraft. It dives on that target. Both Wildcats fire. Whether the target is destroyed or not is secondary. What matters is that the speed accumulated in the dive is converted back into altitude through a zoom climb. The section resets above the shotai. The shotai, now reacting defensively, has lost its offensive posture. If one Zero breaks upward to pursue, the section shifts its next pass to that isolated aircraft. The shotai's mutual support structure is disrupted. 1 or 2 kills are obtained for Zero-friendly losses, provided no one gets overconfident, provided no one stays to dogfight, provided discipline holds. This was not a method for defeating Horikoshi's design on its own terms. It was a method for refusing to engage on those terms entirely. The Americans did not learn to outmaneuver the Zero. They learned to make maneuverability irrelevant. They took the one arena where the Wildcat held a clear physical advantage, the high-speed div, and built an entire combat doctrine around it. They did not fight the war that Horikoshi's genius had prepared for. They fought a different war, and in that different war, the Zero's supreme agility was a weapon that could never be brought to bear. It was working. Through the first months of 1943, the exchange rates over the Solomons continued to favor the Americans, not because the Wildcat had become a better airplane, but because the system surrounding it had become better. Better tactics, better gunnery, better coordination, and, critically, a continuous rotation of veterans from the front lines back to training commands in the United States, where their experience was extracted, codified, and injected into the next class of pilots heading west. But everyone in the American chain of command, from squadron leaders to fleet admirals, understood that the Wildcat was a stopgap. It was holding a line that should not have been holdable, and it was doing so through the accumulated ingenuity of men like Thack and Flatley, rather than through any inherent superiority of the machine itself. The Wildcat was the airplane you fought with because it was the airplane you had, not because it was the airplane you wanted. The airplane they wanted arrived in two forms, and both of them ended the era that Horikoshi had created. The Vought F-4U Corsair entered combat in February 1943, flying with Marine Squadron VMF 124. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat followed in September 1943, deployed aboard carriers with VF-5. Both aircraft were powered by the Pratt and Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing over 2,000 horsepower, twice the power of Horikoshi's Sakai 12. With that power came everything that the Wildcat lacked and the Zero could not match. Speed well in excess of 380 miles per hour, climb rates that closed the gap with the Zero, dive performance that was categorically superior, and all of it wrapped in armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural reinforcement that kept pilots alive. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots climbed into cockpits, knowing they did not have to compensate for their craft. The Hellcat and the Corsair did not require a Thack weave to survive. They did not demand the rigid tactical discipline that the Wildcat had enforced on pain of death. They were simply better airplanes than the Zero in almost every measurable category, and they carried the protection that Horikoshi had sacrificed to make his design. The Wildcat did not disappear. It transitioned to secondary roles: escort carrier duty, convoy protection, ground support operations in theaters, where the newest fighters were not yet available. It continued to fight, and it continued to bring pilots home, because the Iron Works had built it to survive, and surviving was what it did best. But the first-line air war over the Pacific now belonged to a generation of American fighters that rendered Horikoshi's masterpiece obsolete through the blunt application of industrial power that Japan could not match. The numbers from the Solomon Islands between February 1943 and February 1944 told the story in arithmetic that needed no interpretation. According to verified Japanese records, 601 A6M Zeros were shot down. 481 Zero pilots were killed. On the Allied side, 486 aircraft were lost, with 526 aircrew killed. Though these figures remain less thoroughly verified and may be slightly higher. Among the Allied losses, an estimated 144 were Corsairs, 55 were Wildcats, 41 were Hellcats, 90 were P-38 Lightnings, 62 were P-40s, and a handful were P-47 Thunderbolts. The remainder were attack aircraft and bombers. 481 Zero pilots dead in 12 months. Each one representing 2 to 3 years of training investment that the Japanese system could not replenish at the rate it was being consumed. The training pipeline had already been compressed under the pressure of mounting losses, producing pilots with fewer hours, less gunnery practice, and almost no experience against the tactics that the Americans had been refining since Coral Sea. These replacement pilots climbed into cockpits designed for experts and flew against veterans who had been taught by veterans, in aircraft that outperformed them in nearly every category. With armor that forgave mistakes, the Zero would punish with death. Horikoshi's masterpiece was no longer a masterpiece. It was a relic being asked to fight a war it was never designed to survive. And Horikoshi knew it. In Nagoya, inside the Mitsubishi works that had given birth to the Zero, Horikoshi was already trying to build its replacement. The Navy had issued the 17-she specification in 1942, calling for a next-generation carrier fighter that would restore Japanese air superiority. And this time, Horikoshi had a chance to correct the equation that had defined and doomed his greatest creation. The aircraft he designed was called the A7M. The Navy would name it Reppu. In English, the word means strong gale. The Reppu was everything the should have been and could not be. Horikoshi's design included pilot armor. It included self-sealing fuel tanks. It included a heavier, more robust airframe capable of withstanding combat damage that would have destroyed a Zero. And it was designed to be faster, to climb better, and to maneuver at least as well as the A6M it was replacing. On paper, the Reppu answered every criticism that the war had leveled against Horikoshi's earlier work. It was the design of a genius who had seen the consequences of his first calculation and was determined to produce a different result. But the Reppu needed something that Horikoshi had never had with the Zero. It needed a powerful engine. The additional weight of armor, protection, and structural reinforcement demanded horsepower that the SAC family could never provide. Horikoshi designed the Reppu around the Mitsubishi Mk9A, a new engine projected to produce approximately 2,200 horsepower, more than double the power of the Sakai 12 that had constrained the Zero. With 2,200 horsepower, the equation balanced: speed, range, maneuverability, firepower, and protection could coexist in the same airframe. The impossible was possible again if the engine worked. The engine did not work. Not on time, not reliably. The Mk9A was plagued by development problems, manufacturing difficulties, quality control failures. The precision machining required for a high-performance 2,200 horsepower radial engine demanded industrial capabilities that Japanese factories, already under strain from the demands of total war and increasingly disrupted by American bombing, could not consistently deliver. The engine existed on test stands. It did not exist in production quantities. Horikoshi was forced to fly the first prototype, designated A7M1, with a substitute engine, the Nakajima Homare, producing roughly 2,000 horsepower. It was a capable engine, but it was not the engine the Reppu was designed around. 200 missing horsepower in an airframe optimized for 2,200 created the same category of problem that had haunted the Zero, an airplane that did not have quite enough power to carry everything it was supposed to carry. The A7M1 flew for the first time on May 6, 1944. The results were disappointing. Performance fell short of the 17-she requirements. The substitute engine could not compensate for the weight that Horikoshi had added to correct the Zero's fatal flaw. The Navy examined the test data and responded with frustration. The airplane did not meet the specification. Horikoshi knew the problem was the engine, not the design. He pushed for the Mk9A. He argued that the airframe was sound, that the engineering was correct, and that performance targets would be met once the intended power plant was installed. He was right, and eventually, the Mk9A became available in limited quantities. The A7M2, fitted with the Mk9A engine, flew for the first time in October 1944. The results were everything Horikoshi had promised. Speed, maneuverability, climb rate, all met or exceeded the specification. And for the first time in Horikoshi's career, the aircraft also carried meaningful pilot protection. The Reppu was the fighter that could have changed the Pacific Air War. The fighter that combined Horikoshi's aerodynamic genius with the survivability that the Zero had sacrificed. The fighter that answered the question he had been unable to answer in 1937. But October 1944 was not 1937, and the war did not wait for genius. By the time the A7M2 proved itself in flight testing, American B-29 Super Fortress was systematically destroying Japanese industrial capacity. The Mitsubishi factories in Nagoya, the same buildings where Horikoshi had designed both the Zero and the Reppu, were targeted and hit. Production lines were disrupted. Machine tools were damaged or destroyed. Skilled workers were dispersed to satellite facilities that lacked the precision equipment needed to manufacture high-performance aircraft engines. The Mk9A, already difficult to produce under optimal conditions, became nearly impossible to build in quantity under the rain of American bombs. Only a handful of A7M2 prototypes were completed. The aircraft never entered mass production. It never reached a frontline squadron. It never flew in combat. The strong gale never blew. And there was the final turn of the knife. The same industrial gap that had forced Horikoshi to strip armor from the Zero in 1937. The gap between Japanese engine technology and American engine technology had defeated him again 7 years later. In 1937, Japanese engines were too weak to carry both performance and protection, so Horikoshi sacrificed protection. In 1944, Japanese industry was too damaged to produce the engine that would have finally allowed him to carry both. The constraint had changed its form, from insufficient horsepower to insufficient factory capacity, but its nature was the same. Japan could not build what Horikoshi could design. The genius of the engineer was hostage to the limitations of the nation. Horikoshi had tried to redeem his masterpiece. He had designed the redemption. He had proven that it worked, and the war had taken it away from him the same way it had taken away the pilots who flew his Zero, through attrition, through industrial mathematics, through the relentless grinding logic of a conflict that rewarded production capacity over individual brilliance. The Zero flew until the end, not because it was still competitive, but because there was nothing to replace it. Pilots with diminishing training hours climbed into cockpits with no armor, took off from carriers and airfields that were themselves under constant attack, and flew against Hellcats and Corsairs that outmatched them in every dimension. Some of them were assigned to kamikaze missions, the final negation of everything a fighter aircraft was supposed to be. A plane designed to protect its pilot through performance was now being used as a guided bomb. Its pilot, not a warrior, but a warhead. If Horikoshi's equation had traded pilot survival for aircraft performance, the kamikaze program erased even the pretense that pilot survival was part of the calculation at all. After the war ended, Jiro Horikoshi did what engineers do. He wrote it down. His account of the Zero's design and development, published in later years, was not an apology. It was not a defense. It was a technical narrative written by a man who understood, with the same precision he applied to wing loading calculations and drag coefficients, exactly what he had built and exactly what it had cost. He laid out the 12-she specification. He explained the constraints. He described the decisions. And he acknowledged the trade-off that defined his legacy the removal of pilot protection to achieve the performance the Navy demanded, with the directness of a man presenting a mathematical proof. He did not blame the Navy for issuing an impossible specification. He did not blame himself for solving it the only way the physics allowed. He did not claim he would have done it differently, because with 1,000 horsepower and a specification that demanded the best fighter in the world, there was no differently to be done. The answer was the answer. The cost was the cost, and the men who paid it were not engineers in Nagoya. They were pilots over Rabaul Canal and Guadalcanal, and the Philippine TC offered them everything except the one thing they needed when the 50 caliber rounds came through the canopy. There is a symmetry to this story that is almost too precise to be accidental, though it was entirely the product of circumstance. In 1937, Jiro Horikoshi sat in the Mitsubishi works in Nagoya and looked at a specification that demanded the impossible. He found the answer by subtracting the variable that no one else was willing to subtract: pilot protection. The result was a masterpiece that dominated the Pacific for 18 months and then slowly, methodically, killed the men it was supposed to serve. In 1942, Horikoshi sat in the same building and looked at a new specification that demanded a different impossible: an aircraft that carried both the performance of the Zero and the protection the Zero lacked. He found the answer again, this time by adding back what he had taken away, designing an airframe around an engine powerful enough to carry everything. The result was a redemption that worked on the test stand and died on the factory floor, destroyed not by any flaw in Horikoshi's engineering, but by the same industrial deficit that had constrained him from the beginning. The genius solved both problems. The system failed both solutions. The first time, because the system asked the wrong question. The second time, because the system could not build the right answer. Between those two failures, thousands of young men climbed into an airplane that was faster and more agile than anything they would face, and died in it because a single bullet could do what it could never do to the heavier, slower, less elegant machine on the other side. The F-4F Wildcat did not defeat the Zero in any contest that mattered to the men who flew them in the moment of combat. It did not outrun it. It did not outturn it. It did not outclimb it. What it did was absorb the punishment and bring the pilot home. And in a war measured not in engagements but in years, that was the only victory that compounded. Horikoshi designed a masterpiece for the first battle. Drummond, a survivor for the last one. History remembers the masterpiece, but it was the survivor that won the war. And somewhere in the mathematics of both designs, in the weight saved and the weight added, in the armor removed and the armor installed, in the fuel tanks that sealed and the fuel tanks that burned, lies the coldest lesson the Pacific War ever taught. That the question is never which airplane is better. The question is better at what and for how long. Jiro Horikoshi answered the first half of that question more brilliantly than any engineer of his generation. The second half was never his to answer. It belonged to the war, and the war answered it with fire.